if I don't scare you, the other ones shouldn't, just because of how they appear.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Monsters are people too.
Of course they are. I'm Sean.
I'm Brandon.
And on today's show, we are joined by the wonderful Cadwell Turnbull, who is back again with his new book, No Gods, No Monsters. So welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here again.
I was excited to hear about the book. And then even more excited when I started reading it and going, oh, this is some good shit.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You hit it out of the park with this one. I think I made it through the first chapter and I was like, this is going to be really good.
Oh, thank you so much.
It is truly quite astounding, and I'm just generally glad to have you back on the show, obviously, because Caribbean people represent, so...
Absolutely.
But before we continue, a friendly reminder that we want to hear from you. So, if you're listening right now, you can share your comments with us about this and past episodes at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. We are looking forward to putting together a listener mailbag episode very soon with your thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions. So please put some stuff into that link so we can actually include you in our content. That would be really rad. So, without further ado, let's actually get to the main event. So, Cadwell, what the heck is No Gods, No Monsters about?
Oh, it's so hard to describe. The pitch that I usually go with, which is, only, describes maybe like 25% of the book, is that it's a reimagining of the civil rights movement, but with monsters in the modern day, and using modern day social organization to talk about that, and then a bunch of other stuff too. Folklore, quantum mechanics, all kinds of like wonky stuff, gods, all of that in this multi-perspective soup of a book.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I have a huge question that's about precisely this topic. Because as I was reading it, I was thinking precisely what you just said, which is that in a lot of ways, this is a reimagining or an allegory of, civil rights and some issues that are still happening today in terms of, police shootings and related issues. But you're doing it obviously through the presentation of, I guess you could say, otherworldly people that are beyond the sort of default everyday human that we exist as. And so I was really curious about, as you were exploring this and using these fantastical concepts to explore this very significant period of history, what was like the real impetus and what were you trying to really get at through all of this, through this specific element of the monstrous?
Right. I think, in some ways I was thinking about monsters as, in conversation with other forms of marginalization, but I was also thinking about it as an intersectional thing. I really love monster fiction. I grew up and I was a big fan of like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Charmed and, all of those, fantasy shows of that era. And I was just really curious about how to think about those things, how to think about being a monster through the lens of being a person of color, or being queer, or being poor, or being vulnerable in any number of ways, and how that might change your relationship to being a monster, right? And so I don't touch on the upper class monsters a ton in this book, but it's one of the things that I want to play out over the course of the book as well, like how class affects monstrosity, what kind of monsters get to get security and what kind of monsters don't, and that sort of thing. And so in some ways, it is very much inspired by civil rights movements of the past, but it's also inspired by, intersectional approach to marginalization.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because you're talking about the intersectional nature, and you made me think of this moment in the book when Melku reveals themselves to this co-op group, right? They're having a co-op meeting in a barn, which is a fantastic place to have a meeting. And it's this really interesting moment in the book because everyone else is kind of aware, we want to be welcoming of different people of different marginal identities. And Melku's like, I'm a monster. What up? And everyone's like, oh shit. Well, that got more complicated than we were expecting this meeting to get. because it's one of those things that I think maybe you could speak to this better than I can, that I think in a lot of ways this book is trying to explore what happens when people are coming in and they want the security of the space that other people have been granted, and the sometimes the fight that exists to be granted that, because you're not like everybody else. You haven't yet been included into the group. And monsters in this case have not. Melku, even though Melku, and I think this gets to the other question about monsters, but we'll come back to it. So I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about like that scene in particular of trying to like have that moment of, oh, like discomfort is really, I think, what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, that scene is crazy. Yeah, I really was excited about that scene when I was drafting it, because I wanted it to be, this group of, very enlightened, progressive, radical people, faced with something that is unknown and a little bit scary. It's not like being a monster is can be a true stand-in for any other kind of marginalization. There is a lot of stuff that the monsters are bringing to the table that are out there. It's very supernatural, and so I try to play that realistically. Even the most enlightened person within that group might have some fears, and I try to be realistic about what fears they might have, and also empathetic about those fears. And it helps that the prospective character in that section has a close relationship to someone that is a monster, and that is something that he's thinking about as this is playing out.
So one of the things that particularly stands out to me, especially like in the shadow of having read and recently reread the lesson, which is still brilliant, and if people haven't read it, they should stop what they're
Oh
doing
my
and
god,
read
you
it now.
reread it?
Yeah, of course I reread it. Come on,
Oh
it's
my,
dope.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
But like, there are two things that immediately stood out to me in No Gods, No Monsters, like in the shadow of that reread, which is one, I really like this element of your style where you're very good at writing very short chapters, where like individual characters are having very brief but very intense moments of drama that move from one chapter to the next. And you're also very good at visiting multiple characters through multiple different stories and giving each of them significant moments to engage with the core question of that world without like being like overwhelming in terms of characters, which is a big deal because there are a lot of characters in No Gods, No Monsters. And I guess one of the things that I'm very curious as a result is, did you have like any challenges not only engaging with like so many characters, both the monstrous and the non-monstrous, but giving them like enough room to be drastically diverse, not only in terms of their outlook or their individual personalities, but actually like having characters of multiple ethnicities and challenging questions of the diaspora from Caribbean characters and people of color living in the US and other kinds of diversity like that?
That's a great question. So with the lesson, and I'm going to just be real, the lesson kind of came about, by accident. Like I didn't know what I was doing, and I was the primary motivation when I was working on it, and as it developed, was just curiosity. I just kept getting curious. So I started out with, the very first part that I wrote was the part from Derek's perspective, who's like a very central character in the book. And then I got curious, like, oh, what's going on with Derek's sister, or like what's going on with his grandmother? It's like his neighbor is really interesting. It's like, oh, what about her parents? And it's like, okay, the aliens. What about Mira? What's going on with Mira? And so I just kept opening doors. And about 2/3 through, I was like, there is some overarching thing I'm doing. I could see that it was happening. And then I started to be more intentional about it. And then I had to backtrack and make that actually like earn out some of that stuff. Some of the things that were kind of like they were turned down in that early draft that I needed to like kind of push up to the surface a bit more. And then, finishing it off. And, I tend to write all over the place. So the mirror section, which is, near the center of the book, was like one of the last sections that I wrote. And I, wrote it with all of this stuff that I had mapped out in mind. But I got very excited about that form once I committed to it, because what I liked about it was that it wasn't centering one person or one single protagonist. And that, that felt truer to life to me, that there's not one important person. Even if the person is important in a way that we can look at in society, and say that person has an important role, like they're the president or they're a senator or whatever. It doesn't devalue or diminish the stories of people that don't have those roles, and that though they can be just as valuable and just as impactful in the history of the world, the movement of society. I just got really happy about the form because I thought that it would allow me to explore that in a realistic way and play around with, centering multiple people instead of taking one person and saying, this person is the important person you need to pay attention to. They're the chosen one that's going to make everything happen. These other people are just kind of like, support staff for this person's life. And so with No Gods, No Monsters, I was like, well, that kind of happened by accident. Let me do this intentionally. Let me put all of that thought and thoughtfulness up front and see if I could build a story where there's no person truly at the center, that everyone's playing a role and all their roles are pretty big. The hard part with that was really in the very beginning trying to map all of that out and make that make sense. And then once I started writing and things started getting away from me because characters do what they want sometimes, and details kind of just show up. It's like, oh, okay, well, you're doing that now. You're gonna just like, there was something that happened with a character early on, Harry, that surprised me later on in the book. I didn't know that he was going to be as important as he turned out to be, and that his squad was going to be such a big part of that ending for me. And so being surprised, trying to make sure that despite the fact that I was surprised by certain things, that it didn't seem like I didn't know that it was happening, and making sure that that held together really well, and also like taking all those strands and weaving them in a way that hopefully would be satisfying to people that don't really dig that form, or not used to that form, or find that form a bit off-putting. I was trying to make an argument and convince people in some way that it was worthy of doing for what it's saying.
I think that what surprised me is when you were talking about like trying to have this, multi points of view, and how it can be kind of difficult to do that, and not everybody likes that style. And what's weird is I am generally a person who does not like that style when it's lots of different points of view, and I did not have that feeling reading this book at all. Which, even though your chapters are, as Brandon was pointing out, there aren't a lot of very long chapters, right? Chapters are 2-3 pages, sometimes 5 or 6, maybe 7 or 8, but they're pretty quick.
I think there's a chapter in this book that's literally 2 lines long.
Yeah, but they're meaty, right? There's
Yeah.
huge moments about characters. There's a moment with Ridley, for example, which is when Ridley goes home to meet their parents, and it's like one chapter of that meeting, and what is happening seems not like a huge deal, but it is so subtly written that there's a lot just packed into there that if you just sit with it for a minute, you realize you've just told us like an entire character's history without actually telling us the entire character's history. You've just given us enough that we can kind of piece together that story ourselves. And so I think that's what did it. I think that's what made me go, like, not realize what I was reading. So whatever it is you did, you worked. You magicked my brain.
I appreciate that, and I'm relieved. It's a relief to hear you say that you're not usually into that, but it worked out this time. Hope I can do that again. I wanted to go back and say some more to Brandon's question. I was thinking about specifically the fact that in the lesson I was writing about a bunch of people that were like me, and then also a bunch of people that were different from me. But I was drawing a lot from people that I knew, like Henrietta, the grandmother character, is like an amalgamation of my grandmothers and great aunts and my mom, my sister. Like I was pulling a lot from those people that are near and dear to my heart to kind of create this character. Jackson, he's a dude. Like I was pulling a lot from guys I know, and some stuff from myself, and same with Derek. Mira was a challenge, but I as soon as I kind of keyed in on what her emotional core was, I was able to do that as well. And it helped that she's not represented within this world. I could kind of be like, that's how Ina's behave. I don't need to, explain it. That's how the Ina are. But with this book, I very much was trying to get a bit out of my comfort zone. A lot of it is set in a place that I I lived for, 5 years, but I would definitely still consider myself a tourist. Like, I don't understand Boston. I feel like I don't understand mainland anywhere the way that I can intuitively understand St. Thomas. There's nowhere that I've been where I'm like, oh, I get it. It's been kind of like I feel like an alien when I'm everywhere. And so, like, trying to write in that place and trying to act like I had some good sense of what was going on there was a challenge. But also, I was, creating all of these characters whose backgrounds are very different from mine. Carrie's background is different from mine. Ridley's background is different from mine. Lena's background is different from mine. And so, one of the things that I did and I, set out to do in this book that I didn't do as much in the lesson was talk to a lot of people, ask a lot of questions, read a lot, trying to get outside of myself as much as I can. It was a really challenging experience, but ultimately a rewarding one. I feel like it was a thing that I did that allowed me to grow as a person in some ways too. I felt like I was expanding during those like interactions with people, and then I tried to bring that stuff into the book, but kind of filter it through myself and do different things to it and spin it and remix it so that it felt like it was its own thing. And I think that was challenging and fun.
I think that there's a lot of value in the story as well as in general because of like that core question in the book of like how does a society come to terms with that kind of radical knowledge and also come to terms with that knowledge in the face of violence is a very intense question to ask a reader all of a sudden, just in the same way that it's a very intense question to ask of like actual people in the world. And I think the book, it takes a lot of care to consider why people feel the way that they do, even when that feeling is potentially hostile, while still giving room for us to potentially come out of the end of that experience going, well, how do we make this better and safer and more whole for everyone as a result? And I think that knowing that you were willing to ask those questions of people that you were attempting to represent is part of that work as well. And I think it's actually kind of inspiring to know that you gained something from that process as well.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like, and this is, part of the thing that I always hope for when I'm writing is that through that process, I'm like, there's some kind of transformation within myself. Whatever, if it's something that I'm kind of like reckoning with from my past, or it's if I'm looking forward or ahead in some way through the writing, I hope to learn a lot and grow a lot. And I felt like this book was so challenging. I had to grow in order to do it, and I hope that I'm working on the second book right now, and that I'm having some growing pains again. Books are hard.
Yes, this is true. But like in that vein, I'm kind of curious, like what is the thing that you think you learned that was most radical in that regard in the process of writing this first book?
Oh wow. Great question. I think the thing that I think that was most radical was that, oftentimes with, movement, I think a lot about like, social movement stuff and, being radical, being the type of person that sticks your neck out and, puts yourself in harm's way. I think one of the things that I realized through working on this is that people, even when they are putting themselves out there and putting themselves in harm, have very complicated feelings about, and this may seem obvious, but feeling it in your bones, really complicated feelings about what they're actually doing. It's not the kind of thing that you do with complete conviction and without fear, and that you kind of you have to negotiate at each step what you're willing to do and how that's going to affect the people around you, and you have to give yourself some grace. I have a lot of characters that are, I would think about Lena, for example, dealing with a lot of guilt, and part of her journey throughout the book is trying to give herself some grace for some of that stuff, because Rebecca says, pretty early when she's trying to comfort her, like, you were 10 years old. It was, one of those things that I think has been good for myself as well. There's characters in this book that are based on or inspired by, I'd say more inspired by people that were very close to me. And so there's like a sort of, through exploring these characters, reckoning with those relationships and, giving grace, not making excuses for things, but also just looking at people as people. I think that's the most important thing. It's like, yes, there is a right answer to things, or there is a an answer to things that is responsible and moral, but people are still people, and giving looking at all of the things that make up a person, what makes up the decisions that they make. I hope I'm not talking about this in a vague way, but I'm trying to avoid spoilers.
Oh, no, no, no. I
Um,
get it.
yeah.
So I do want to ask, because like you kind of talked, Brandon was like using this word radical a lot, and I thought it was really interesting that this book explores co-op groups quite a lot, which as an American is something that's pretty new to me, because the first co-op I ever saw was in Santa Cruz, but the first co-op I've ever been inside of a co-op business was in now where I live in Bemidji, which has a grocery store called Harmony. And I was really excited to see all of the exploration here of like the philosophy that kind of goes behind co-ops. There's even, really extended scenes of people who are part of the organization of a co-op or a sequence of co-ops, sort of talking about how co-ops work and working together to kind of create this. And so I was curious. Well, one is a very serious question, which is when are we starting our bookstore co-op? Because I would like to start that immediately. The other question is this coming from, to some degree your own personal experiences with co-ops, or was it more of a thing you just wanted to really explore in this book?
So the answer to the first question is right away. I'm down. Let's do it. Oh, and related to that first question, there is a cooperative bookstore in Asheville, North Carolina, and it's anarchist. It's all of the things that I wrote about, but I didn't at the time know that bookstore exists, and it's a pretty prominent bookstore. I pretty much just kind of like cobbled all the things together from talking to different people about different things, and then making it work. To answer the second question, when I was in grad school, I was thinking about a story that I wanted to write where there was a public housing a projects in some inner city. Like I didn't pin down where it was going to be yet, but that whole community kind of came together and decided that they were going to go into what at the time I didn't realize this was what it was, but a cooperative enterprise. They would cook food and deliver food. They would do ride sharing. They would do all of these different things as a community, and then they would pool all of those funds and resources to kind of like build out that community. I was thinking about what that kind of thing would be like. What value that could bring to even where I'm from, Virgin Islands. Like I just got really excited about that idea as a speculative idea. And I was like, it's going to be set in the near future, blah, 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 blah. Went on Google, and in 2 minutes, I found, like, I was like, oh, that is a thing that already exists. They're called cooperatives. And that kind of, began my, like, my dive into that world, so to speak. When I moved to Boston, I went to a co-op meetup. It was like there was an organization, locally that was just comprised of a whole bunch of co-ops in the area, and this was like platform co-ops, people, co-ops that are like online. They exist and their work is primarily online, and it's like 3 or 4 people, and they co-own it and they co-govern it. They make all the decisions together. Bicycle repair co-ops, the traditional like cooperative grocery stores, housing co-ops, which was a thing that I didn't particularly know about. Intentional communities, all of these people just coming together and talking, eating pizza, and I was there, and I was just like, it's like, who are you and what are you doing here? And I was like, I'm just interested. And I met a lady that was just really nice, older black lady with dreadlocks, really just like the warmest person that and like super radical, and had like a really interesting background, and what brought her into the movement. And she introduced me to someone that was a part of this organization called Grassroots Economic Organizing, and that group published articles about co-ops, and they met monthly, and they had like a budget, and they most of those people were from co-ops or had co-op history, and it was about like co-op outreach stuff, and I got involved with that. Wrote a few articles, did a few podcasts, showed up to a bunch of meetings still to this day. I just fell in love with it. Long story short, really just got really interested in everything co-op, and even like imagining beyond co-op, like there's radical branches of this movement as well that imagine things even further out, and so I knew that I wanted to bring that into a book somehow. And I figured the best way to do it is to like kind of have that be a thing that is just a part of the landscape of the book. I didn't want to just like bog it down like I'm doing right now with co-op talk. I figured it would be really neat if a few characters within the book are a part of a co-op. What kind of co-op would that be? And I was like, a bookstore. It just made sense to me.
I mean, it makes total sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of have a follow up because we've spoken in some capacity on several levels before about like community movement work and like its capacity not only in fiction but in the real world. And obviously it's been a through line in some of your work for a while, like Monsters Come Howling in their season, which you published in 2019 on The Verge, is also about collectively owned technology and how that responds to a potential moment of crisis. And like one of the things that stands out now that I'm thinking about it, is that your work is concerned not only with how the speculative changes our perception of movement work about community work, but also how community work responds specifically to crisis, which is particularly significant because your book comes in the shadow of the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, where a lot of the big concerns that people have are about how we do these progressive outreach projects specifically in response to crisis. That there are moments when things are not always going very well, and we need to know how the progressive designs that we are working on can respond specifically to that thing without having to be fractured in its goals or in its effort. And I'm kind of curious as a result if you also see any through line through that work, and ultimately what you think is the thing that you want people to gain from engaging with your work in that sense.
It was a thing that when I was first starting out, when I was attending, the early meetings with the grassroots economic organizing collective, which is, there's a collective in the book called the Ascent Collective that is very much inspired by that collective that I've engaged with in my own life. One of the things that I was saying, it's like, the thing that I think would make cooperatives more present, like people would be able to look at it and name it, is the kind of the humanizing part of it, not just the idea and the concept, but like who are the people behind it. I think that coming from a writer who tries to be active, but is constantly beating myself up about not doing enough. I One of the things that it was really important to me with throughout this whole book was to show a bunch of different characters that are really deeply engaged in things that they care about, but are sometimes traumatized by things, or are that they have to make a journey towards doing the thing that they know they want to be doing. It's a difficult journey for them, and I think that human quality is the thing that I want to, share, want people to get from it. That, the people that are doing this movement work are not always sitting around talking about the movement. Or sometimes they're like baking bread, or sometimes they're like, hanging out with, someone that they really care about. Sometimes they're just like nerding out about a TV show that they love. And I think that aspect of it, the full picture of the reasons why people get into this kind of work, the things that make them go there, is just as important as the thing that they're doing. The history and the context is just as important as the move, so to speak. And that neither of those things should overshadow each other. That we shouldn't forget the human and what they're doing, and we shouldn't forget why they're doing it. That those things are both important.
I want to take this as a segue point because we're talking a lot about, lots of people working together cooperatively. In this case, in with some degree of intentionality, right? There's a philosophy they're trying to follow together. And your book deals with other elements of people working together, or maybe being, in some cases, less friendly about how they're working together. Because I wanted to talk specifically about cultural memory, which seems really important in this book, not least of all because we have a huge question about how, as a society, people remember events and how those events can be manipulated and what that can do to our understanding of the narrative of our culture. It is a pretty significant element of just how perhaps how news media, but also our, that can influence culture at large to affect what people see, what they talk about, how they perceive historical events and our memory of his historical events. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, your approach to this idea of cultural memory.
That's a deep question. So, okay, I have been for a very long time, and I think and this goes back to the why people gravitate to things. I had, from very young, a very suspicious, view of the world. Like the world always seemed strange to me. Like it always felt like there was like I describe something in the book called the black hand. They always felt like there was something behind. If you looked hard enough you could see it. I've always been like looking, trying to uncover the thing that I don't understand. It always felt like something I just didn't get. I think that has something to do with how we remember events and what we decide to put down and what we decide to remember. I think that there's a ton of things that happen in life that it's impossible for us to peel back, not just because there's too much information, but because it's too difficult emotionally or psychologically. That these things have psychological effects, and and this is another thing that I felt like was something that I learned through doing working on this, is that people actively make decisions to step away from looking at something that's hard, even though they recognize that it's there, and that they do it as a protective mechanism. And so one of the things that I was exploring in the book, specifically with the monsters, once things pop off and then some of those things kind of get obscured or hidden, is that people are just completely ready to step back into their original way of looking at the world. That they just put it right back into the box, and that is a self-protective measure. And there's a lot of people within that context that are ready to just kind of perform that self-protective measure with them for themselves, right? This is a way that we create a reality that's more comfortable, and we can see parallels to how we treat racism in this country and our history of atrocity. People actively fight to put it in the box and put it away and hide it. And other people will not only support that, but then on the flip side of that, act as if nothing ever happened. Like the people that are like, well, even if you want to put this in a box and put it away, it happened. And there's just like, I don't know if that happened though. And I feel that way about how we talk about, I'm going to sound like I have a tinfoil hat now. I feel that way about how we treat abuse from institutions of power. When I'm talking about specifically like an example, the Tuskegee experiment, or FBI harassment and of black activists and black artists, the drug war, all of these things that we know are connected to institutions of power, that it happened. We pretend as if those things can't happen the next time. We're like surprised somehow. And we kind of do a lot of like gaslighting of people that are suspicious of how institutions of power work in our lives. We tend to be like, well, that's just being paranoid. And I'm like, well, for a lot of people of color, it's not paranoia. You can't just flatten it and turn it into that. You have to give that room and space. And but again, we like reality that makes us comfortable, and we will write a reality as a collective, as a group, that we're comfortable to exist in. And that might mean ignoring a lot of the evidence of abuse, of oppression, of subjugation. We just put it back in the box, and then we all perform the comfortable reality. I hope I'm making sense.
No, you are.
100%.
I mean, that's not a tinfoil hat thing to say.
Okay.
One of the things that immediately hit me in the book, and I thought that this was like an intentional thing that you were like paying off as a result, was there is an overlap between some of those actions in the book and the way that people have responded to instances of police violence that have taken place in the US in the last 2 years. That the video is there, everybody's seen it, it was on the news. And then 2 weeks later, someone is like, but I thought I saw this. They didn't see it. Or I heard that so and so happened before that recording happened. It didn't happen. And once that's been said enough times, that is already rewriting the narrative for which there is already documentation. And the fact that that can happen, and the fact that people can buy into that kind of belief and still buy into those beliefs to this day in an attempt to excuse that violence or to justify that violence, I thought was like a deliberate working of the novel to like remind us that this is a thing that can happen. It can happen very easily. And it's happening not necessarily because people are evil, but because they don't want to think about the world that they live in as potentially volatile at every moment. And as a result, they constantly make excuses for the volatility that they witness.
Oh man, I'm so glad you brought it up and you framed it that way because I mean this is always happening, and police brutality is always there. I can point to something within a month's time in any direction that is an example of this particular issue. But I remember when I was in grad school, there was just like a series of high profile incidents and just video of all of these incidents coming out. And at that period in time I was hopeful. I was like, oh, maybe I can like have conversations with people and have them see that this stuff is connected, to other things. And if I do it in a compassionate way and it's not like, I'm not trying to like, shove anything down their throat. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just like responding genuinely. They'll get it. It was immediately frustrating how narrow people got with when talking about this. So like what I mean specifically is every time a video comes out, almost immediately people just try to restrict it to what's happening in the frame. It has no connections to anything else that's happening within our society. And so we want to judge, well, what was this person doing? The example that I'm thinking about specifically is how a black person within that context will respond in fear, and how someone watching that video will be like, well, why did he do that? And a black person would be like, that person was afraid. It's fear, and it's instinctual because guess what? Black people understand in that context what is going to happen. They know what's going down. It's not like they're surprised by the moment itself, And so that fear is real. And I can look at that image and be like, that is fear. That's what's happening. And I can connect that to a history. In conversations on the news, online, everywhere, it's like, oh well, what did that person do in that frame, and how did that make the officer feel? You know what I mean? As if those two people exist in a vacuum and there's no context beyond that frame. It's not a one-to-one thing, but one of the things I wanted to do in the book was kind of like reveal this thing and then just keep pulling back and pulling back and pulling back so you could see all of the different things that are connected to that one moment. Like Lincoln showing up on that curb has a long history to it. What happens with the cop, has a long history to it. What happens after the video comes out, you can see all of these tendrils of connections. And part of my goal there, in a way that I wasn't trying to be didactic about it, but I was just trying to say, what if we open the frame? What if we respond to these moments by asking deep, penetrating questions about our society and our systems instead of just like, oh, well, what did that person feel in that moment? How do we stop these things from happening again? That requires deeper questions than how people feel in a moment. This conversation got really heavy. I'm
It
sorry.
did get really heavy.
I
We can
mean,
talk about something else. I'm sorry.
No, I think this is, the fact that the book explores this came from this cultural memory question, and the fact that the book explores this in the way that it does, I think, draws up all of the ways, not just on this particular issue, but a lot of issues in at least in the US culture, of how we use narratives to like create comfort zones for how we talk about the society that we live in.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I was gonna, I'll say this really quickly. It's one of the reasons I'm attracted to cooperatives is because it's an approach where a bunch of people respect each other enough to trust each other and share resources. Part of the thing that's frustrating to me about these kinds of narratives is that we feel like it's better if we create the situation or the structure or the system where people don't need to be helped, where people are secure and they're safe. And that requires a radical revisioning of how we organize our world And that only happens if we question our reality. We question the things that make us uncomfortable.
This book does it to not on all the issues, but it does cover quite a number of them in I think a very compelling way. Well, okay, so I can we maybe we could take it to a less heavy subject. We kind of talked about this at the beginning, and I think it makes sense to kind of come full circle on this because this book has a very curious take on what the monstrous means. Because and I kind of said this. I think both Brendan and I have said this earlier that the people that have been defined as monstrous in this are the whole gamut of magical supernatural variations, right? They could be werewolves, but they could also be just like someone who's a tech mage, essentially. But all of them have been labeled as monstrous in society, and I was really curious about how you saw yourself exploring what monstrousness actually means in the context of a real world.
Yeah, it's within the book, there's like the kind of defamatory way people talk about the monsters in the book, but they also, the monsters themselves refer to each other as monsters. It's like a term of solidarity. And it's kind of Melku, one of the characters, the tech mage, the way that they framed it was that if I don't scare you, the other ones shouldn't, just because of how they appear, right? It's kind of, through that kind of larger term and bringing everyone into that umbrella, it's kind of a way of the monsters that are cuddly. I wouldn't consider Melku cuddly, to protect the less cuddly ones. And so, I was just thinking about, well, if this community existed in the real world, they would have to have remained secret for a really long time, right? And if they did that, they had to lean on each other a lot to maintain that secrecy. And that in a world like that, all of the monster beings, all of the different kinds of monsters would have strong ties to each other, or some kind of tie to each other, some kind of social structure. And it was one of the things that I was interested in exploring, that they would be a part of something, and it would be across different kinds of monsters. It wouldn't be that all one monster is in one camp and another monster is in another camp, because you can't ensure protection that way. There would be a kind of like a network of protection.
I value that not only in that sense, but it also speaks generally to the kind of solidarity that movement work depends on. That one group of marginalized people depends on the entire community of the marginalized in order to activate that kind of work. And I thought that it was really neat as a result that this somewhat derogatory term was something that they reclaimed so quickly because they needed language to communicate amongst themselves. And I thought that that was really neat.
Is there also an element here of, because I was thinking with Melku and some of the others kind of like Melku, that an issue of like passing is present as well? Because Melku can just not do magic. And no one, I mean, literally when Melku shows up, nobody knows that Melku is quote unquote a monster. But others have less control. So like the werewolves, right, need to release their inner, their wolf has to get out because otherwise they probably will eat all the Cheetos in the house or something, right? So and so I was curious that like an element of that is an awareness of, some of us have a privilege, a privilege to pretend as though we're like everybody else, but we can instead use that to say no, we're gonna work together. But I don't know if I'm just reading too much into that maybe.
No, no, you're not. You're not. Part of that conversation, and in that scene, Ridley feels a little bit like Melku is being manipulative by bringing a cuddly monster. I wouldn't consider Cassie a cuddly monster either. Into the space of saying like, we're monsters. There's other monsters that might be scarier than us, but they all need safety. And it looks like it's a move that Melku is doing. But one of the things I would argue is that, like, Cassie being this character as a sight mage, that affects her experience of the world fundamentally. It's very difficult for Cassie to act like a normal person. Cassie knows too much, like. And so one of the things that I think that I was trying to play with is all of these different ways, these different kinds of monstrosity and abilities would affect individual people in visual ways and then in non-visual ways, but that both of those experiences would be equally weighty. Like, I can't imagine Melku would be happy not using their magic either. I think they need to do it. It's something that beyond the usages in the plot, it's something that is a essential part of their identity.
Also, if I just want you to know, you should read this book because you will get the best response to any question you don't want to answer ever. I love that whole part. And once Ridley figures it out, it's like, oh yeah. Good for you, Ridley.
Oh, right.
Yeah. I'm not gonna say anything because it's a spoiler, but once you get to it, you'll know, and it's totally worth everything in the world because it's such a clever sentence, just that response, anyway, I'm gonna shut up because it's a thing, but go read the book and you'll understand.
There are other reasons to read the book, but also this, yes.
Well, yes, like there are thousands of reasons, but I'm just saying if you just want to have like a way out of answering any question you don't want to answer ever again, this book will help you.
Noted.
In a way, you wrote a self-help book and you didn't know it.
God.
Oh wow, I did not think about it that way, but now I'm glad that I have provided this service. This is
alrighty. Well, we can't keep talking about the book or all the 3,000 other things we might talk about forever because we all have lives and Cadwell's got to go write and do other things in his life other than be here. And so I want to say thank you again, Cadwell, for coming on. It's just fantastic to get to talk to you, and I'm so excited that this book exists and that you're still writing, because if you stopped, I would be sad.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. I hope I answered your questions adequately, and looking forward to the next time. We have to do this again now.
Yes.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's gonna happen.
We are obligated to this now. But until then, if you would be so kind, would you please let everyone know where we can find you and your work?
All right. Yeah, you can find me at cadwellturnbull.com. And if you're looking on social media, I'm lucky enough to be the only Cadwell Turnbull I know online, so it's all at Cadwell Turnbull or at Cadwell Turnbull author. I should be pretty easy to find.
Yeah, well, perfect. Everyone listening at home, thanks for coming today and listening to this episode. If you'd like to suggest topics again, go to skiffingfanty.com/listener suggestions to let us know. If you have comments about this episode, we'd love to hear about it. As always, follow us at skiffingfanty on Twitter and Instagram, and get the newsletter at skiffingfanty.com/newsletter. And again, we're working towards those 50 reviews on iTunes, so please get those out there. And if you like what we do, patreon.com/skiffingfanty for all the supporting shenanigans. We're working on stuff, so come hang out with us there. As for me, I am at Sean Duke on Twitter, seanduke.net, or patreon.com/thejoyfactory.
And you can find me at The Rising Tides on Twitter and Instagram, and GMing The Case of the Sinded Seal at speculatesf.com.
Awesome. And as always, I got to make the ending of this awkward. And so I just want to say that I think of all of the magical beings that exist in this book, the one that I would probably have the least ability to handle would be a werewolf, because of just how often they are naked. I don't know if I could handle being naked around other people all the time. I don't know if I could do it. It's just a little awkward.
That's legit.
Yeah, I feel you.
It makes me think there should be some werewolf clothes there.
Right?
They should be able to get dressed in their werewolf form. Why is that not a thing?
Like, the Hulk. It's like the Hulk. He always manages to have stretchy shorts that somehow manage to stay on him so that you don't see his giant Hulk penis. The same thing. Except I guess with werewolves, when you turn into a werewolf, you become furry, but it's the other way you got to worry about.
Right. Now I'm just picturing werewolves with like suits and ties. It's great image.
Book 2.
That's what's happening in book 2 now. Who tailors for the monsters? So yeah.
It's in there.
Awesome. Well, on that note, awkward ending and scene. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.